Kia ora koutou, everyone. Welcome to our second to last rehab conversation of 2025. My name's Steph Thompson, the current NZRA president, and would like to welcome you all warmly to our hui this afternoon. I'll just open us up with a karakia and then we'll go from there. Te kue te wairua kia rere ki ngā tāmata. Hai arahi I a tātou mahi, me tā tātou whai ngā tikanga a rātou mā. Kia mau, kia ita, kia kore ai e ngāho, kia pupuri, kia whakamau, kia tina, hui e, tai ki e. Kia ora everyone. Thank you for joining us. We may have a few more people join as we go along. It's my pleasure to introduce Megan, who is going to talk to us about supporting client motivation and why the why of rehabilitation matters. Megan's a Canadian OT with a vast range of experience and is currently studying for her PhD at the RTAU at the University of Otago, Wellington, looking at community stroke rehab and occupational performance coaching. Please, as we go along, pop any questions that you have in the chat. We'll have time at the end for questions and a bit of an open discussion. So pop those in the chat as you think of them. I'll be monitoring that, and I'll pass over to Megan. Thanks.
Kia ora, everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and share real quick just to get my slides up here, and hopefully everybody can see this. Tracking good so far. Okay. Told staff I'm not great with technology, so I'm going to try and do my best, and I'm going to also try and keep an eye on the comments without hopefully getting myself too distracted. But yes, thank you. So as Stephanie said, I'm a Canadian OT. My family and I have been in New Zealand just over 2 years now. I have a bit of an eclectic background as an OT because my husband's in the Canadian military. So that's why we're here in New Zealand. We're here on his posting. And I've been lucky enough to start my PhD with Fiona Graham while here. And as Stephanie mentioned as well, it's on Occupational Performance Coaching in community stroke rehab. That's where I have the bulk of my background is in community stroke rehab. So it's something I'm particularly passionate about. If you'd love to hear more about that, I'd love to tell you more about that. Please feel free to get in touch. But today I'm here to talk to you about supporting client motivation. I know it's a bit of an obscure title, why the why matters. Hopefully that'll make sense as I go through. But I recognize these are conversations in rehab, and that's really what I'm hoping to spark today, is to give you some information, hopefully not get too in the weeds about client motivation, but really hoping to spark a good conversation at the end about why client motivation matters, or why I think client motivation matters, and then I'm really hoping to hear your thoughts. So hopefully, again, it'll start to make a little bit more sense as I go through, but I'll go ahead and dive in. I'm going to be talking to you today about client motivation through the lens of self-determination theory. So just as a quick reminder of what that is. It's a pretty massive theory. It was created by Richard Ryan and Edward Deci over 40 years ago. So as those of us that have been around that long know, we kind of learn and grow and expand over that much time. And this theory has as well. It's quite an extensive theory. So I'm really only going to touch on a really small piece of it. I'm going to try and make it as coherent as possible. But just know that if there's bits that seem missing, it is because it's really quite big, and I'm just going to touch on a small piece of it. So they started, how self-determination theory started out was explaining what intrinsic motivation is. That's really where they started. And their definition is that it's a class of behaviors energized by their inherent satisfactions, such as in activities one finds interesting or enjoyable. Okay, so it's activities that we do just because they're fun and interesting or enjoyable. Okay, so I've got a picture here of a little kid chasing a ball. I mean, we could imagine that this kid is doing this for reasons other than just the fun of it, but I think it's probably pretty easy to imagine that this kid is just doing this for fun. Okay, as opposed to the other side of the slide here, where we're talking about extrinsic motivation. And the key difference, at least according to self-determination theory, between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is that when we're talking about extrinsic motivation, there's a goal. And that goal is not just to do an activity because it's fun or interesting, okay? So the goal is separate from the inherent interest or satisfaction of the activity. So when we look at this picture of the kids doing football drills, we can easily imagine that there's a goal, right? Whether it's to improve their skills or get ready for a game, there's a goal. It's not to say that they're not still having fun. So this isn't a difference between enjoyable versus non-enjoyable activities. They can both be enjoyable. The key difference is that there's a specific goal outside of that inherent interest in the activity. Okay? Is that clear so far? Feel free to jump in at any point if you have any questions or if I'm not making sense, okay? Or pop it in the chat. I'll kind of try and keep an eye on it. So I'm going to talk a little bit further about extrinsic motivation. That's really what I want to talk about today. So the next thing I wanted to dive into and a little bit deeper is one of the specific theories within self-determination theory, because it's actually a meta theory. It's got 6 mini theories within it. This one's called organismic integration theory, and this one specifically talks about extrinsic motivation. And the reason I want to break down this title for you is I think it really helps to explain what the lens is that they're talking about when they talk about extrinsic motivation. So the reason that they call it this, the organismic part, is because it's this idea that we are living human beings with an inherent tendency to want to learn and grow and develop into a unified person as we go through life as part of a larger social community. And that part of a larger social community is really key to the integration piece. So this is this idea that as we go through life, we're taking these external societal values and beliefs and norms and behaviors that, again, are not inherently interesting or enjoyable, and internalizing them, okay? I think a good example of this is something like hand washing, okay? So although we could imagine that if you gave a toddler a bar of soap and a bucket of water and just let them go to town making bubbles and splashing with water, they'd have a great time, right? That's super intrinsically motivating to that child. But when we attach a goal to that, which is hand washing, this particular value, this particular norm, suddenly we're now talking about extrinsic motivation, okay? That toddler's not doing that to get rid of the germs on their hands, to clean their hands, right? They're just doing it because it's fun. When we start attaching these ideas, these goals, we're talking about something that's extrinsically motivating. And again, the idea is that we pick up these different behaviors from the people around us as we go through life, okay? I'm going to keep going because there's a little bit more about this, and hopefully this will start to make a little bit more sense. Okay, so I've got this big diagram here. I'm really going to talk to you about this middle bit. Again, we're focusing on extrinsic motivation. And with extrinsic motivation, Ryan and DC talk about 4 types of what they call regulations, okay? The first one is external regulation, and this is probably the one most of us think about when we think about extrinsic motivation. This is rewards or punishments that kind of push somebody towards doing or engaging in an activity. Okay, so I'm going to do this to avoid a punishment or to get a reward. Okay, the carrot or the stick. Okay. The next step in, or the next regulation is called interjected regulation. And this is where we take these sort of physical external rewards or punishments and they become internal to somebody's head. Okay, so this is things like guilt or pride. So I'm going to wash my hands to avoid my parents being disappointed in me, or to avoid upsetting somebody. Or I'm going to wear a particular outfit so that people will think highly of me. They're going to think I look really cool. They're going to be really impressed by me. Okay. You might have noticed that there's a little bit, and I don't know if you can see my cursor, called perceived locus of causality. So this is where these forces that are sort of acting upon somebody's motivation are coming from. So when we think about the reward or punishment, these are very external forces that are pushing on that motivation. When we're talking about something that's now sort of in our head, they're still, yes, they're in our head, but they're still somewhat external, right? This is what we think other people will think about us, and that's sort of pushing us towards doing an activity. Okay. The next step is identified regulation. And one of the big things I want to emphasize here, what comes into play is values. When we get to identified regulation, somebody has identified with a value in the activity. Okay, so to bring this into rehab, you could think of somebody doing a particular exercise because they see the value in that exercise getting them towards their goal. Okay, so it's not just that they're doing it because they don't want to disappoint you, or they think maybe you'll discharge them if they don't do the activity. They can see the value in that exercise. Okay. The last type of regulation is called integrated regulation. So this isn't just that somebody sees the value in the activity, that the value is a part of who they are. It's a deeper level of that value being important to them. I don't know if it's a helpful example, but when I was really trying to think about differentiating these two things in my head, integrated regulation really made me think of the book Atomic Habits, if anybody's read that, where he talks about identity habits. And the idea is that, let's say you have a goal for running and you decide, I'm going to run 2 days a week, or I'm going to run 3 days a week, and you miss one day and then maybe you miss another day, and it kind of snowballs. Whereas if you, instead of just setting a goal for I'm going to run so many times, you tell yourself, I'm a runner. I'm going to run because this is just a part of who I am. So you could miss running once, doesn't matter. You know you're going to do it the next day or the day after, because again, it's a part of who you are. Okay? Are all of those kind of making sense? I'm going to get to why this is important, but does the distinction between those different regulations make sense? Have I lost anybody anywhere? See, there's a question.
Yeah, so there's just a question. How do you think cognition impacts on the continuum, especially
yeah, so I think it's a good point. So the reason that Ryan and DC talk about this being a continuum, and again, going back to that whole organismic integration piece, is the idea is that we tend to move along it through life. We tend to see these behaviors or norms or beliefs from the people around us, and we tend to move along it. Some behaviors and norms, we of course will never integrate, right? There are some things that you would have to give me a big reward for me to engage in that activity, right? At this end of the scale, we have a motivation. And a motivation is not just, I'm not motivated or I have no motivation in activity. This is, I see no value in this activity. So I have no intention of engaging because I see no value in it, okay? So it's not to say that there's this great thing about, one end of the scale or the other. There are reasons that we want to mostly engage in activities towards this end of the scale, but we all sometimes need external motivators. And for any given activity, you may have multiple motivations. So I don't know that that's really necessarily answering the question, but what I'm trying to get at is that depending on where the person is, they may need different motivators. And that's part of the why that I'm hoping to talk about is why it matters where we're meeting people. Okay. So I'm not sure if I completely answered that. If I didn't, please let me know, and I'll give it another go. The other thing that I wanted to mention, so this is called the continuum of relative autonomy. And the autonomy piece, I feel, is quite important. In self-determination theory, when they talk about autonomy, there's two key ingredients. We're talking about choice, but choices that are values aligned. So that's why I kind of tried to emphasize that values piece. Okay, so it's not just choices that are aligned with a person's values. And the more that the choices are aligned with that person's values, the more we say that those choices are autonomous, or we're supporting that person's autonomy. Or in this diagram, they say it's more self-determined. Okay. So again, at this end, not self-determined, the person does not see any value in this. All the way at the other end, this is highly aligned with their values, highly autonomous, highly self-determined. Okay. So I've spoken to it a little bit, but I just want to dig into why does this all matter? Why am I going on and on very deeply about this? Okay. So as activities become more integrated and more autonomous, engagement and performance increase, as well as overall well-being. This is what lots and lots of research from self-determination has shown. Okay. I'm hoping this is already somewhat clear. Again, if we think about somebody who's only doing an activity because they're either going to get a reward or they're avoiding a punishment, once that external motivator is gone, that person's going to disengage. They have no other interest in this activity. So we could understand that their performance is probably not very high, right? They're only doing this to potentially avoid a punishment or to get a reward. They're also likely not to be super engaged, as opposed to somebody who's doing this activity because it's a huge value in their life. Okay, it's something that not only do they enjoy, but they see great value in. Okay, and hopefully the overall well-being also makes sense. I think we can especially imagine that if somebody's doing an activity to avoid a punishment, that could create a lot of stress and anxiety, right? So in terms of mental health, people are a lot better at this end of the spectrum when they feel like they're making choices that are aligned with their values. Okay. The other key piece is that our perceptions as clinicians on client motivation affect how we engage with clients. Okay, and this is not just something I'm just throwing out there. There are several references. I've given you one. Please feel free to dig into its references if you would like. But the things that it brings up in that particular article are things like our opinions or our thoughts on somebody on discharge plans, or whether or not we think somebody should continue on into another rehab service. It's also things like, if somebody's really, really disengaged, it can be hard potentially for us to be really engaged, right? So our perceptions of client motivation matter. Okay. Does anybody want to speak to this? Does anybody disagree, or anybody does this or agree with this, or anybody thoughts?
I think certainly your point about how we perceive someone to be, like how motivated someone is to engage with us, can affect how we feel about things, but it's almost, we need to flip it on its head, and what are we not doing to support this person to engage is how I try and think about it. If I'm struggling to engage someone, clearly rather than putting it on them, I try and turn it back on myself as something is not working here. What have I missed?
A great point. That's a great point. And Stephanie and I did not practice this ahead of time, but that's a great setup to for for the next point is hopefully both Steph and I have convinced you that this does matter. And so then how do we support client motivation?
Sorry, can I
So
just add something?
yes,
to that?
sorry.
Yeah. The other thing I was saying is that being aware of the other impacts on that person, the other, I'm a social worker, so the other social, psychosocial impacts that they're dealing with. So often people we're working with have a lot of rehab commitments, but they also have a whole other life commitments for many reasons, and that sometimes is perceived as lack of engagement when it's just overload.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
100%. Yeah, definitely agree with that. Definitely agree with that. And hopefully that that context point will come up in this as well a bit. Jenny, thank you. So in self-determination theory, they talk about the fact that everybody, as in this theory, they believe everybody has three basic psychological needs, and every single one of these needs to be supported in order to support a client's autonomy, in order to support their ability to make autonomous decisions. Okay. And again, it's all three are needed. Hopefully you'll see as I go through them, they're quite interconnected, and different people need different levels at different times. So to Jenny's point, as you can already see, we're talking about autonomy, relatedness, and competence. Perhaps, somebody really needs we need to lean into that relatedness piece and really understand where this person's coming from and meet them where they're at. But perhaps somebody else, who's really concerned that they just don't know what to do, needs more support in terms of competence. But I'll go through these and just walk us through them a little bit more. So as I've said, one of these is autonomy. So it's a bit of a theme. It's partially a bit of a theme because it's a big part of my research. So that's I'll put it out there. That's probably a bit of my bias, although I do think they would agree it's an important part of their theory. And again, within self-determination theory, we talk about choice plus values alignment. And I don't want to put too much of a point on this, but I am going to lean into it just a little bit more because I'm getting ready to do a scoping review around autonomy supportive behaviors in rehab. And although we haven't finished yet, one of the behaviors that keeps coming up, that keeps getting mentioned, is this idea around choice. It's often things like we provided choices or the client had choices. And I think it's really important to emphasize the values part of that, because you can offer somebody choices until you're blue in the face, but if those choices are not seen to be what they define in self-determination theory as true choices, so those are choices that are, again, aligned with somebody's values, they don't really mean anything. Okay. And I'll try and get into that a little bit more. So down here, we talk about how these can be supported. So by choices, but I'm going to take you on a journey. Hopefully we can understand it's a little bit more than just that. The explanation piece is the idea that a client might have a goal in mind, and you might see certain exercises getting them to that goal. But if the client doesn't understand the through line, they don't understand the connection, that is not a true choice. Okay, they don't see how that choice is aligned with their values. Okay, so they might, to speak to a point Steph made, they might disengage or not be engaged because they don't see the value in it. But if we can connect that activity to their value, hopefully we will see their engagement go up. Okay. Another way that we can support client engagement is through empathy, by deeply understanding where they're coming from. I think this speaks a bit to Jenny's point about understanding, their context and all the things that they're dealing with, right? I think there's a part of it also to understanding somebody's motivations. What is at the heart of what is motivating somebody towards something? When I think about this, I think about a client I had once, or the spouse of a client I had. It was a palliative client, and I was working with the spouse because unfortunately the patient was non-responsive by the time I was involved. And I went in to see this spouse one day, and he was very tired. He was quite upset. He was in a lot of pain. He was having a lot of difficulty with bed care with his spouse, turning and just doing general bed care. And I had the best intentions in the world. I was coming from a good place, and I said, you know what? We can get you a hospital bed with an air mattress. It's covered through our program. She'll be more comfortable. You won't have to turn her as often. It'll be easier to move the bed and do bed care. And the spouse was not upset with this suggestion, but he said to me that, his wife really wanted to die at home. She didn't want to be in hospital, and they already had so much hospital equipment, and he didn't want anything else that was going to make it feel like their home wasn't their home anymore. So I don't think I did something necessarily wrong there, but I think if I had the space to allow him to really give me to really tell his story about where he was coming from and what he was hoping for, then I could have potentially talked about true choices, things that were really aligned with what was important to him in that moment. Okay. All right, so I've talked a lot about autonomy. I'll move on to relatedness, which of course, when we're talking about empathy, this is what I'm saying. These are really connected. But relatedness also goes back to that original point about organismic integration theory. So this is about being a part of a group and a family, and that helps us to know what values and beliefs and norms to attend to. And the more that we integrate those into our lives, the more we become connected with those people around us. Okay. Of course, it extends beyond this. This is about connecting with clients. This is about, showing empathy. This is about showing respect, creating environments that are safe enough where people can share really, really important and precious information with us. Okay. And then the final piece is competence. So people are more likely to engage in and maintain activities in which they feel competent. And as competence grows, they're more likely to internalize their motivation to continue to participate in the activity. So for me, this is like conjuring up ideas of, playing a musical instrument or learning to play one. You first start plunking out on a keyboard. It doesn't even sound like music. And then the more you learn and the better you get, it starts sounding like actual music, and your motivation grows, and it kind of snowballs from there. Okay. Before I move on to sort of the last piece, tying this back into rehab, does anybody want to does this make you think of any practice examples of how you try to support any one of these or all three of these in your own practice?
Can anyone hear me at the
Yes.
moment? Yeah. Hi, I'm Alicia. I'm an occupational therapist. I recall struggling in this space when I was working in inpatient stroke rehab, where somebody was just really focused on wanting to be able to walk, and their family really were focused on that, but they hadn't achieved sitting balance. And you were, needing to work on sitting balance, and you understood the rationale and the clinical reasoning behind that. But for the family and for the patient, for them to sort of have the understanding, I should be moving my legs, we should be standing up practicing, but you're needing to work on sitting balance, and making sure that you continue to have that buy-in and engagement, but not losing their hope or their motivation that they wanted to be walking.
Yeah, that's a really lovely example. Thank you. Yeah. Did anybody else want to throw out any examples? Yeah, thanks, Caroline. I think that's a great point as well. Open-ended questions to support, yeah, to help support the client's autonomy. Yeah, 100%. I agree with that. Okay, well, I'll move on. The last thing I want to talk to you about is self-determination theory in healthcare and rehab. The reason I have healthcare and rehab is for whatever reason, despite there being quite a lot of research around using self-determination theory in rehab, Ryan and DC have not yet decided to have a nice full chapter just on rehab in their books. So if anybody wants to put a plug out there for rehab, so it is really kind of intertwined or talked about within healthcare in general in their books specifically. And I want to bring this up because I think they talk about supporting or self-determination theory in a quite an interesting lens, in my perspective, within healthcare that I really think has in some ways been carried over into rehab. So I'm going to talk you through this a little bit, and hopefully this will feed into our discussion in a few minutes. So I'm just going to read you out something, hopefully if I can see it on my screen. So this is from this is the introduction to their chapter on self-determination theory in healthcare from their 2017 book. And the title is Healthcare and Patient Need Satisfaction, Supporting Maintained Health Behavior Change. And so this is a bit abridged, but I promise I haven't changed the meaning here. So health is often compromised by habits and lifestyles, such as using tobacco, eating unhealthy foods, and failing to exercise. In addition, poor adherence to healthcare interventions and prescriptions also compromises health outcomes. So hopefully what you gathered from that is that the way that self-determination theory in general has been applied within healthcare is this idea that we want to support behavior change towards better healthcare health behaviors. So the idea that although people are living longer in general, they're living with more chronic diseases and the effects of those diseases. And so we can stave off that if people chose better habits. So how do we motivate people towards better choices or to make changes? Okay. Within rehab, I'm going to just read out two quotes just to give you a general idea. This first one is from a rapid review of randomized control trials and systematic reviews on self-determination theory in physio. And this is brand new. This one was published this year. So motivational interventions primarily targeted adherence, exercise behavior, and levels of physical activity. And then one last one in stroke rehab. If I can find it. Okay. Unfortunately, most older stroke survivors tend to feel unmotivated to rehabilitate. Thus, stroke survivors' motivation needs to be enhanced in order to increase willingness for rehabilitation. Okay. Promise I didn't cherry pick these. They might be sort of more towards the extreme end of how these are described, but I will say within the literature on self-determination theory in rehab, if there's a term that comes up the most often, it's adherence. So the idea is that we are using self-determination theory, we are supporting motivation to increase adherence. Okay, so on that point, I just want to put out a plug that I think this matters. I'm going to end with getting your thoughts on this. But one of the reasons I think this matters is sort of going back to thinking about that what we had talked about the extrinsic motivation, the different types of regulations, and you know, what are the things that are motivating people. So, you know, in just sort of that sense, I think it matters what is motivating us to want to motivate our clients. It's going to affect how engaged we are. It's going to affect our potential performance, how good we are doing, how we are interacting with clients. So I can see the parallels. I think it does matter why we want to motivate people, why we think that's important, and how we want to motivate them. But I am interested in your thoughts. I'm interested to know, why do you think this matter? Or I guess, really, does this matter? Do you also think this matters? So does it matter what is motivating us to motivate our clients? Do you think that there's a difference between motivating a client to engage in rehab versus motivating them to get back to their life? So I think this is that adherence piece. You know, are we simply motivating them to adhere, even if it is towards supporting a long-term goal, or is that different from simply motivating them to want to get back to their life? So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yeah.
Right, so opening up the floor for a bit of discussion. Who would like to start?
Actually, I find it very difficult to motivate ACC clients because they're getting those payments, they complete rehab, get good reports from the physio to say that they're able to do this and that, but the clients are not motivated to go back to work. They prefer to have the ACC payments for as long as possible, which is a bit frustrating at times.
I can understand that frustration. I guess the follow-up question I would have, sort of in line with sort of all the thinking and the theory, would be, does that matter? If that is what their motivation is it our job to want to come in and change their motivation towards something that they may not value at that point? And I think that's a good example of trying to get at the question. Perhaps it's not the way to think about it, and please feel free to say, no, I don't think that's right. But that is sort of at the heart of my question. If that's what's important to them at that moment, is to get those payments, perhaps, is it our job to shift those behaviors, to want to change that?
Yeah, because sometimes I'm working with clients and they are told, now you've only got 3 weeks. That's it, no more payments. ACC's cutting them off. And, you know, I've seen it so many times, and I've seen people who've gone to the unemployment benefit, which is a big pay cut. And I've seen other people, because they don't qualify, relying just on their partner for income. So looking into the future, it is, you know, the client will find it very difficult. And it's trying to motivate them to see into the future that these payments will not continue forever.
And do you see that as potentially part of that, the providing them with information piece about supporting their autonomy in terms of choices? It's a real choice, and here's why I think it's a real choice.
Yes, I've done that with clients. And then in the last week, I get these hectic phone calls, which is by then, you know, they can't find a job within a week. It's too difficult. Yeah. That's, you know, they're just not motivated. You know, a lot of them, some are very motivated and they take all the opportunities provided to them, but there's those ones who, are not motivated. no interest, no motivation.
Do you think there's anything within those three basic psychological needs, the autonomy, relatedness, or competence, that can shift things for people in your mind?
Some of them it's their values. I mean, clients have been quite honest with me. They have stated that, you know, they like the idea of getting an income without having to work for it. So, you know, it's their the way they think about things, and it's very hard to shift.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point.
Mm.
There's a few comments in the chat as well. So I think there's a difference to adhere to rehab as in our system, and that the pressure of discharge sometimes means we push adherence, as this might keep them in rehab for longer. Jack H says, feels like trying to motivate someone to adhere to an agenda that we set isn't really giving them a choice, which I think
A real
is a really
choice. I
good
appreciate
point.
it. Yeah.
Yep.
Real choice. Yeah.
And Caroline has said, in my research with stroke survivors seeking to improve real world walking, she measured intrinsic motivation and they scored highly, but were physically inactive on step counts. And the issue she thought was around not a lack of motivation, but not knowing what to do and feeling emotionally overwhelmed and frightened about walking in the real world.
Yeah.
So motivation was there, but maybe that competence.
Yeah, well, and I think,
actually...
yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, the competence and feeling, yeah, certainly the competence, feeling frightened and overwhelmed. I think those are things that are very understandable and that we certainly see. So yeah, I would 100% agree, Steph. I think again, it goes back to this idea that the more we're able to sort of elevate that competence or all work on, it sounds like this is yes, and Caroline, I think agrees, yeah, that the leaning into that competence piece for that client is really important, and hopefully will strengthen that motivation and help move them towards feeling like they are having true choices and autonomy.
And
any other thoughts from anybody?
I'll put my 2 cents in. I just thinking about your question around, is there a difference between motivating someone to engage in rehab versus getting them back to life? I think that again comes down to what their priorities are and really understanding what it is that they're wanting from rehab versus if they're just wanting to get back in and do life, that's actually okay as well. And maybe there's other things, I think like Jenny said, other things going on in their life that perhaps the physical rehab side of things is just not their priority at the minute, and us being okay with that is really important as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree, because I think it comes back to that piece of of supporting people where they're at. I can understand where they're coming from in this idea of supporting health, wanting to support health behavior changes, but I think it's almost slightly ironic when we're talking so much about true choices and then we're throwing out this idea of wanting to potentially move people towards other ways of doing things that we inherently value and trying to pull them towards what we value. Whereas I agree. I think I can understand. Again, I think people have put in comments about, somebody might be in inpatient rehab and we've got certain pressures there. A friend of mine who works in inpatient stroke had said, the goal is to get people home. They might have other goals, but the goal is to get them home. And, I can understand all of those those things. But hopefully hopefully it's been at least interesting to kind of think about where people might be and how we engage with them, and where our motivation comes into play with their motivation.
Thank you. Are there any other, we've got 5 minutes left. Are there any last minute questions, comments, anything else people would like to discuss? Christina makes a really interesting point. I think if we've gone through a thorough client-centered goal-setting session, the understanding of getting back to life and rehab should be in synergy.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think that comes back to that idea of true choices. If we've really heard and understood people and listened to what it is that they want to do, those two things should hopefully be in line.
Brilliant. All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming along and your participation, and thank you very much, Megan. That was a really interesting and thought-provoking topic. I'll just close us off with a karakia before we head off on our way. Kia whakaaria te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara, kia tūruki whakataha ai, kia tūruki whakataha ai, haumie, huie, taikie. Kia ora everyone, thank you very much. The recording will be sent out once Rochelle is back from leave, and we will shortly be advertising our final rehab conversation of the year, which is coming up towards the end of November. Thank you very much.